Hi there folks, it's book review time and I have been reading Sweet Francaise by Irene Nemirovsky, and this is quite an extraordinary book, not just for its content and writing, but for the circumstances surrounding the writing and the discovery of this book, and I'll go more into that towards the end of the video. Tilly's found a patch of sunlight there. So this is, it's an unfinished novel for very tragic reasons, which again I'll go into later. And it's written and set during the early years of the Second World War in France. It's a novel in two parts, and right at the very beginning, we have the German, the defeat of France and the German occupation, and immediately people in Paris starting to panic and flee from Paris. The first part of the novel is called Storm in June, and I'll just talk about that part first. There's no strong main character, particularly in this first part of the book. It basically kind of tells the story of several groups or couples, families, trying to get out of Paris at the time where the Germans occupied Paris. And the description of how awful, how difficult it was, the traffic, the lack of food, the lack of petrol. But what she really goes into in this book, both in the first and the second parts, is the kind of human psychology of what is happening and the kind of human characteristics that come out during this time of crisis. And particularly, although there are sympathetic characters and there are characters that are not so much. But what really comes out is some of the hypocrisies of human nature. Hello, you coming up then? Here she is. Oh, you're all warm from the sun. Lovely. So she really talks about great deal of hypocrisy, the way this kind of crisis kind of, you could say, changes people, but maybe in a way, it's all right, you could say it kind of brings out the worst in them, but sometimes it brings out the best in people. But she really does point out some of the hypocrisies of human nature. For example, one of the characters criticizes greatly some of the other characters for being just out for themselves at the expense of all others, when they are doing exactly the same themselves. So part one takes up really very much half of the book, and it's full of these descriptions of fleeing from Paris and where various people end up or not. Some of them go back to Paris. It's interesting to note that Nemirovsky herself, she was a Russian Jew living in France, and she herself left Paris at the point of the German occupation and fled to a village. So these descriptions of the flight from Paris are very, very real, and she really describes it all very, very well. The second half of the novel is very different. It doesn't focus on the same characters. There are some links from the characters in the second half to some of the characters of the first half. So she does link the two parts that way, but it's very much like two separate stories. But the second half, titled Dolce, tells the story of a village that is actually occupied by the Germans at this time. And I think I liked this second part better because it was so psychologically interesting. The way she describes the very difficult, tenuous, tense relationship between an occupying force and the occupied community, and how they kind of form some sort of relationship. It's really quite fascinating. And she kind of points out that sort of difference between looking, the big picture. It's an occupying army, and it's a village community, and to all intents and purposes, complete enemies. But that is set against the actual reality of individual people. So there are young German soldiers who are quite willing to integrate into the community, to be friendly, to be polite. And of course, they have left their wives and girlfriends home in Germany, while the people in the village, particularly the women who have husbands, sons, etc., in Germany as prisoners of war, of course, there are going to be individual relationships forming, although rather awkwardly, perhaps. But she focuses particularly on one woman whose husband is a prisoner of war and forms a relationship with the German who is billeted to stay at her farm. And the relationship that grows up between them, she does it so well, so sympathetically, with a real understanding of human nature, both for the occupier and the occupied. But of course, these relationships are never going to be free and easy. It's such a fragile relationship, that the one between the occupying army and the defeated community. It's a really fascinating picture of what happens to people in that circumstance. It's such a strange and sad and disturbing circumstance that is generally unusual, but she really explores it and describes how, this again brings out different human emotions and sets people against each other. And we also see the inner thoughts of various people in the community and how they feel about things. It's very, very interesting. And although it is an unfinished novel, in fact, I believe she'd intended to write a whole other section and a whole other part 3, it actually doesn't feel unfinished. It ends on a quite a natural ending. So you don't feel like you've sort of missed out on anything. But apart from that, the plot itself, it's not strong. It's not a sort of strong ongoing story. It's more of an exploration of this human nature in this crisis and the relationships in that crisis. But it's also set against some wonderful descriptions. She's very, very good at describing the senses and the surroundings, the atmosphere of this farming community. For example, the scent of roses on a summer's evening. So she cleverly sets up this rather lovely, kind of romantic, almost blissful setting of this rural village against the fact that they are occupied by an enemy army, which is a very interesting juxtaposition. Yeah, I found that part of it absolutely fascinating because I don't think I've read many uh, books or novels that really look at that relationship between an occupying force and the occupied village or town. Now, all that being said, yes, I think it's a wonderful novel. I think it's definitely one that I would recommend to people. However, I have to admit, in parts, I found it quite a difficult read. It's quite dense in its writing. The writing is lovely. For me, and this is personal taste, it's not really a criticism. There's a lot of interior thought. There's not very much of a plot, and for me, almost particularly in the first part, there's no main character that you can particularly relate to, which uh, in the first half I found that a kind of missing feature. There were too many characters and nobody to particularly focus on, and not a lot of dialogue. There is some, but there's not a huge amount of dialogue. The second part I found a little bit more easy to follow because there is one character that kind of stands out, but there's no real strong plot. It's just about this relationship between the two communities and the relationship between two particular individuals. But she covers so much that there's no strong story. It's more like a kind of investigation, a kind of exploration of these things. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with all of that. It's just for me, sometimes I like to get stuck into a story and a main character, but that's just me. So I do recommend this book. If you are interested in looking at this particular moment in time as the German army occupied France, I would definitely have a look at this book. There is also a great feeling of sadness reading this book if you know what happened with the writer, because there's a very tragic story surrounding the writing of this book. Irene Nemirovsky, as I said, was a Russian Jew living in France, and she left with her husband and children. She left Paris and lived in a village. Now, there are some appendices at the back, which I have to admit, I haven't sort of read in great detail, but I did have a look through some of them to get some of the story. And it really sadly, as she was writing this, she was arrested and ended up eventually in Auschwitz, where she was sent to the gas chambers while her husband was desperately trying to find ways of getting her out. But he, in turn, was also arrested and had the same fate. So it's absolutely a tragic story. And their children were still very young at the time, and it was her daughter Denise who, as she was leaving their house, picked up her mother's manuscripts, not knowing actually what was in them. And years later, as an adult, she finally decided to type these up, thinking that they were basically just journals and diaries, and discovered this almost complete novel. She sent it to publishers and it finally got recognised and published. So an absolutely extraordinary story surrounding the novel. And of course, we have to remember that while we're reading this novel, that it is unfinished and probably mostly unedited. So some of the writing sometimes feels a little bit loose and but it's for a, if it was a first draft, it's a particularly good first draft. So yes, it was 65 years after her death that this novel finally got to be discovered and published. Quite an extraordinary story surrounding the writing of this novel, and really tragic. It does kind of create a bit of a shadow over the novel as you're reading it too, knowing what happened to the writer. So I have to say, although I think it's a marvellous book, it took me a while to read through it, partly because I was watching Wimbledon too, but partly because I've just found reading it a little bit difficult and a little bit dense for me. But that, as I say, is just me. And I'm glad I have read it. So, don't be put off by my taste by any means. Now, on to my next novel that I'll be reading and reviewing probably in a couple of weeks, perhaps. Something completely different and much, much lighter, I think. It looks to me really like a bit of chick lit that I don't usually buy for myself. And I think this is, again, one of the books my mother picked up. She did like a bit of chick lit, my mother, and I'm sort of reading through all the books that she left behind. This is called Out of the Blue, and it's by Belinda Jones. And it's about a woman who works on a cruise ship, and when she's taking time off in the island of Crete, she meets and falls in love with a man but she also believes he's a bit of a cad. So where does that take her? So yeah, I'm looking forward to something a bit lighter than what I've just been reading, I have to admit. But whether this will be my kind of book, really, we will only have to wait and see. So that's what I'll be reviewing next. As for what's coming up next week, maybe time for another A to Z of authors. Last time was George Eliot, so we're probably into the F's now. Yeah, I can think of a few that might be in there. So hopefully that's what I'll be doing. But if I think of something else that's more maybe seasonal or urgent, we'll see. I'm always happy to consider any suggestions you have for videos as well. So until then, have a great week, everybody, and I will see you again very soon. And as for Tilly, she's now in her favourite place behind the curtain. Here she is. Yeah, no, it's not, sweetie. Yeah, there's a good girl. Bye-bye for now.